So welcome, my name is Tim Macpherson, and this is another one of our webinars that Saltwater Boat Angling does in association with Navionics. And today we're going to talk about bluefin tuna, which is a very exciting subject and one that is on the tips of many tongues in the southwest at the moment, as anglers and fishermen and other people see many of these fish busting out of the sea at this time of year. And here with me to talk about it is Steve Murphy. He's a keen saltwater sports fisherman and he's fished all over the world, particularly for tuna. He's a member of the Angling Trust. He's the conservation officer for the Sport Fishing Club of the British Isles. And he's also the founder of Blue Fin Tuna UK, which is a campaign to try and make sure that the UK gets a quota for bluefin tuna so that we can recreationally fish for them. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So, Steve, now, as I said just now, we're seeing reports of Atlantic bluefin tuna this summer and during this part of the autumn too in the southwest, and actually a bit further up the channel too, I think, and in the Irish Sea. How widespread do you think this presence of fish is? And more importantly, why are they coming back every year?
Yeah, sure, Tim. Well, as you say, that it's very widespread. I mean, these are not isolated pockets of fish. We're seeing them all across the UK's western waters, across Irish, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish waters. And they really sort of reappeared around about 2013, 2015. And these patterns are sort of seasonal migration. So these fish spawn in the warmer seas, whether it's the Gulf of Mexico and the West Atlantic, and some other spawning sites there, or the Mediterranean. And then after the spawning period in sort of May, June, July, they head north in the autumn to fatten up again. So there's always been a sort of a natural northern progression into the far northeast Atlantic. But really, the last 4, 5, 6 years, the scale and the extent of that has been quite dramatic. Now, why it is, well, I suppose we don't really know 100% for sure why, but it's likely to be a combination of factors. So the first really is that the North Atlantic is subject to a series of sort of long-term climatic cycles that last around 30 to 40 years. And these change not just water temperatures in certain locales, but the entire current structure changes. And this creates different habitats. And so it affects, obviously, everything from phytoplankton through to small fry to the fish that prey on those and the fish that prey on those and so on and so forth. So you've got things like mackerel stocks, for example. People say, well, there's no mackerel anymore. Well, there's less mackerel in the southern waters in the UK, but there's certainly no shortage of mackerel overall. They've just moved further north.
Oh, right. Okay.
On the other side of the coin, we're seeing a lot more of Mediterranean type fish species in the southwest, as well as things like anchovies. We're seeing an unprecedented number of anchovies in the southwest of the UK. So these cycles, people tend to talk of them as being warm and cool phases. It is more complicated than that, but it's quite a nice description. So the last sort of big warm phase that we had was 1925 to 1963. And some of your viewers will recall that's really the heyday, includes the heyday of the Tunny Club and the whole bluefin tuna sport fishing operation that operated in the North Sea, out of Whitby and Scarborough and so on.
It's one of those things in people's memories, isn't it? Catching North Sea tuna. Yeah,
absolutely. And these guys were there in their tweeds with this like 1930s fishing tackle, and they attracted, movie stars and the rich and famous, because it really was one of the biggest sport fishing destinations on the planet, really the early to mid 30s. And then after the war and the early 1950s, that fishery really disappeared in the mid 50s. And we think that was as much down to the depletion of the herring stocks at that time as it was to the climatic conditions. Right. Because the Norwegian commercial fishery carried on really until 1963 across the North Sea. And then in 1963, bang, that all stopped. The fish practically disappeared in the far North Sea Atlantic from that point onwards. So we had a cool phase then. Sorry, Tim.
So I was going to say, people often think that it was our overfishing that was the demise of particularly the sort of North Sea tuna fishing experience. Clearly, what you're saying is it's actually the feedstock that they were living on that was driving them out. Is that correct?
So I've no doubt that some of the numbers of fish that were taken didn't help, but I think the evidence seems to suggest that really it's these longer term habitat environment conditions and the availability of prey that are the biggest factors. Of course, you can overfish, and we'll touch on this shortly. You can overfish a species and affect its distribution. So we had this cold, cool phase from 63 to around about 2000. We have no fish present really in the far North East Atlantic in these seasonal migrations. And then about 2000, we entered a warm phase. The fish, I mentioned earlier on that these fish really began to appear back in our waters and Ireland and so on, around about 2013 to 2015.
I was going to say, there's no knowledge of, as far as I know, of people seeing or catching them accidentally in the early parts of the century. So that's quite an interesting point. So why is that?
Yeah, well, that brings me to my second point, really, in terms of, why are they here? And I think you have to bear in mind that early 2000s was really the period where Atlantic bluefin tuna stocks absolutely nosedived. They were on their knees. I mean, we had decades of commercial overfishing, and the Atlantic bluefin was on a path to extinction. So I think you had that habitat environment was improving for these fish. The numbers were being so devastated, particularly those mature fish, which are the ones that have the greater tolerance and tend to come further north. That I think it's just that there wasn't as many fish around at that particular point in time. And what's happened since 2007, ICAP, the governing body, put a recovery plan in place for the East Atlantic Mediterranean stock, which is important to note that this stock comprises around 90% of the total. Less than 10% is the Western Atlantic, the American stock, if you like. And that recovery plan began to bear fruit, and numbers have begun to recover since about 2010. So I think you've got this combination of the habitat has changed, that environment has changed, and in the last 10 years, you've had a recovery in numbers. And I think perhaps that sort of greater competition for food, those kind of issues are driving the fish further north as well. So there's a lot of research going on into this right now, but we don't know 100%, but it's not as simple as global warming. It may well be that global warming is exacerbating these conditions and is making the habitat even more favourable in the autumnal months. But I don't think it's clearly not the single factor for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about the water temperature, and just earlier on, about the changes in that. Most people think that bluefin tuna are a sort of tropical fish, don't they? They don't associate them with our waters. So how I mean, is that just a misnomer?
Well, not all tuna are created equal. There's one particular branch of the tuna family that have adapted to allow them to really tolerate a much wider range of temperatures. So the subgenus Tunnus, which includes albacore, big eye, and the three bluefin species, southern bluefin, Pacific bluefin, and Atlantic bluefin. They're the most adapted of the bunch, and Atlantic bluefin in particular. And they're endothermic, which basically means they have the ability to sort of maintain their body temperature at a higher level than the surrounding water. And in fact, they don't just maintain it, they can regulate that temperature as well within a particular range. So for Atlantic bluefin, that means they can actually tolerate water temperatures as warm as the low 30s and as cold as down to 6 or 8 degrees. They have this heat regulation system. The blood that's coming from their heart is cold, and the blood that's coming back through the veins that's been around their muscles is warm. And they have this interchange which allows like a pre-warming of that cold blood, and obviously muscles operate better at higher temperatures. They have these huge gills and can extract more oxygen from the water than we extract from the air. And that enables them to do these huge great migrations, tolerate wide ranges in water temperatures. They can dive to 1,000 meters in search of prey, and then bask back on the surface and so on. So they're really pretty amazing, pretty special fish. But they're certainly, when it comes to Atlantic bluefin, you shouldn't think of them as a tropical water fish.
So there are reports, of course, about bluefin tuna being endangered. Everyone seems to think that, and that's not just bluefins. I guess it's all species of tuna have been under a lot of pressure, haven't they? So this kind of at odds with your comments about the fact that we've got a recovery certainly in the Eastern Atlantic where we are, So what's happening to the stock then, and who's actually managing that stock? Because obviously somebody must be doing that.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the management issue, so obviously bluefin, their habitat and their migrations cut across numerous jurisdictions. And if you didn't have a joined up management process, everyone would be doing their own thing, and the stock would be fished to extinction within a decade. So this was recognized after the war. In the 1960s, a group got together and formed a global management organization for the species, which is the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, bit of a mouthful, ICAT. We talk a lot about ICAT.
Yeah.
And currently there's around, I think, 75 nations, if you include the EU individually. It's around 75 nations signed up to it. And they agree sort of quotas, the science work is all funded between them, quotas are allocated between them, etc. From the mid-90s until around 2007, the total allowable catch, the quota, if you like, for Atlantic bluefin all across the North Atlantic was around 30-odd thousand tons. We now know, having gone back and they've data mined how many ships were at sea, how many fish were being sold in markets in Tokyo and so on, that in fact, each year they were taking between 50 and 60,000 tons as opposed to a 30,000 ton quota. So, with that and the growth of tuna farms, which were incredibly damaging in their early days, it's not surprising that stocks absolutely were collapsing. And by the early noughties, another 10 years, you would have been looking at effective extinction of the species. Fortunately, ICAT finally got their act together. In 2007, they implemented a 15-year recovery plan for that Eastern Atlantic Mediterranean stock, about 90% of the total stock. They slashed quotas, they increased monitoring and enforcement, and they put controls on tuna farms. What effectively happened was you went from 50 to 60,000 tons per year being caught over the quota to a point where the quotas were cut to about 13,000 tons, and they were probably catching not far off of 13 to 15,000 tons. So it was a massive reduction, in quotas.
When did that kind of kick in? So what year are we talking about? So from 2007 to when they were taking 60,000 tons to what year when they were now? Is that now? Is that what we're
2010, 2011. So we can talk about the where we are now on quotas and the recovery, but certainly initially that reduction was in 2011 when the quotas were really first reduced dramatically. Right. But the point was, say, in 2010, we didn't know if these measures were going to really be effective. We didn't know if the stock was going to continue to decline or just level off at a low level. And so the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they managed a red list that I think many people will be familiar with. In 2010, they carried out an assessment using all the ICAT statistics and concluded that Atlantic bluefin tuna globally were an endangered species. That was published in February 2011, and they were spot on. At the time, we just didn't know what was going to happen. The really good news is that recovery program did begin to bear fruit pretty quickly. So within 3 to 4 years, there was evidence coming through that the stock had stabilized and was beginning to recover. So as soon as 2015, and the IUCN carried out an assessment of that 90%, the Eastern Atlantic Mediterranean stock. And what they found was that the recovery was substantial. There was question marks over the precise extent of the recovery, but they actually applied a rating that was 2 notches better than endangered, near threatened. And they almost used, you can read this stuff online on their website, they almost used the least concern rating, but there were some uncertainties about the previous 2 to 3 years of data. And that's a common theme in bluefin. We still know there's a lot of gaps in what we know about them. But it was clear really from 2017 onwards, it was pretty clear that that 2011 endangered status was already out of date. Now ICAT the IUCN are mandated to review these every 10 years, and they will be reviewing the global status of Atlantic bluefin again right about now. The ICAT carry out their stock assessments every 3 years. One is due in this year, in 2020. Because of COVID, and the constraints that's had on their meetings, they've been unable to carry out the fully comprehensive review, which would have been updating and tweaking a lot of their models. But they have just published their findings, and lots of caveats again. But what it shows is that the recovery is real, it is substantial, but there are definitely uncertainties about the exact scale of this. I mean, I guess to give it some context, core model that they use, the VPA model, and they revise this every 3 years. Obviously, it's not just like set in stone. That suggests that stocks troughed around about 250 to 270,000 tons. This is the stock spawning biomass, in around about 2010. In 2017, that model suggested that stock levels were back up to about 500,000 tons, which was back to the mid-1970s level. Now, at face value, this latest assessment indicates an SSB that's in the order of 750,000 tons. Now, I don't think anybody really believes that, but the point is, there is a recovery. That recovery is acknowledged by organisations like the WWF and Pew Charitable Trust. But obviously, we need great care as far as commercial quotas to ensure that we don't reverse that. So, and the key thing that comes through is more data is needed. And one great source of this information, really for the last 20 to 30 years, has come from recreational anglers and their involvement in research projects.
Okay, so it's clear that numbers are recovering in the Eastern Atlantic or waters around us. And if there are so many fish, why can't anglers, and anglers are accidentally catching them, aren't they? And they see them all the time. Why can't we catch them? Because what a fabulous sport they must be.
Well, they would. But the reality is that, okay, so the UK has been a member of ICAT under the EU umbrella for as long as we've been a member of the EU. But we did not have a share of the EU quota for Atlantic bluefin tuna. Now, that kind of makes sense because, look, we didn't have fish in our waters at that time, and we didn't have the specialist sort of long-range offshore fleets of longliners and purse seine vessels to operate in the North Atlantic. So there was no need for a quota. And the ICAT rules are very clear. Only members of ICAT with a quota or a year-by-year derogation for special research projects we'll come back to. But you've got to have quota to be able to fish for them. And that's commercially or even for recreational catch and release fishing. Because ICAT recognises, as we do, that there is some level of mortality associated with even with catch and release fishing. And that mortality has to be accounted for in the ICAT statistics. So you have to have quota. So to operate in the long term, to operate a recreational fishery, even catch and release, we need to acquire quota. I mentioned briefly, there are other ways you can fish for them. There's sort of this year by year, you can get a derogation for a scientific research based capture. Those programs, the Irish coined the phrase CHAR, which is catch and release tagging. Right. ICAT will allow that. The Scandies, Denmark and Sweden, and the Irish have been operating these for several years. The Scottish just got permission to operate one this year.
This is research and development purposes, isn't it? So they're catching fish, tagging them, measuring them, and then releasing them.
That's right. Yeah, and there are various forms of that. I think we're going to talk a bit about about the different research programs, but these are really sort of large scale recreational angler led. But they are they're regulated. They're authorised vessels. It's a very controlled process that are putting lots and lots of fly tags, dumb tags in these fish, as opposed to the satellite tagging programs, which are much more high cost, high tech, that answer different sorts of questions. So we put a proposal in to DEFRA early in 2020 to try and operate a chart program in the UK. They have come back and established a consultation process with us to look at the possibility of such a program in 2021. And we are working on that with a number of different stakeholders.
So you set up the Blue Fin Tuna UK group, 2 years ago. What's the purpose and objective of that campaign group? I guess it's tied up with what you were just saying, in relation to fly tagging, I guess, was it, in those programs?
Yes, I mean there's a bigger prize actually than that we're looking at. But the background is that I was fishing out of Falmouth in 2016. There's a smell. I know that smell from somewhere. I couldn't work out what it was, and then I started to see the oil slicks, on the surface of the water, and it's like, that's fish oil. I mean, the last time I smelled this was like, off of Florida Keys or Mauritius or somewhere. And as we got further out, you start to see these masses of birds, busting, and beneath them, there's these huge fish that are busting on the surface. And we got closer, and it was, I mean, we'd been told that there were bluefin around, but I really never dreamed I would see that kind of image in UK waters. So I thought, okay, maybe it's a one-off. 2017, we got these fish reappear again. It's exactly the same images. So we thought this is something that's quite significant. It may not be a one-off. So I started to do some research. These fish may actually be here for several years yet, and there's going to be a requirement to manage them. And what a fantastic opportunity. If the numbers are recovering and the fish are here, and dozens of other countries have recreational fisheries for them, it's like, maybe we should be doing the same thing. So I looked around, but no one was really focusing on this at the time in the fishing world. So I approached a large number of charter skippers. I knew guys in my club that were very experienced, big game fishermen. I went to the Angling Trust, and we had a discussion, and I sort of pitched the idea that maybe we should be looking at, a sort of a recreational live release fishery for them, because this looked like it was a world-class fishery on our doorsteps.
Very exciting, I have to say, very exciting. And I remember getting pictures of people sending me pictures of tuna busting and people accidentally catching them around about that time, I think, about 50 years ago. They are fantastic fish.
And what the Angling Trust really gave me was sort of the sense of, okay, how do you develop a strategy? And that's what the Angling Trust did for me, is they put me in the room and enabled me to talk to the people that were influential in whether or not this would happen. And I mean, it really is an absolutely world-class fishery. I mean, this is not hyperbole. I've been very lucky to fish a lot of places on the planet. And what we have here in terms of Atlantic bluefin is really, even within bluefin circles, it's quite unique, because the sheer numbers of fish that we have, and we're seeing this through sort of sightings and the level of bycatch that's going on, are substantial. The length of the season, these fish arrive in July, and often they're still being seen in November, even into December. There's not many places, outside of the home waters like the Mediterranean, where the season is that long. The fish are Goldilocks size, and by that I mean they're sort of a 250 to 500 pound fish. So they're big enough that they're the fish of a lifetime for anglers. Some of these fish are within 1, 2, 3 miles of the shore. And they're in areas where you have a great tourism infrastructure already, and ports that that could easily transition to operate fleets that could run a recreational live release bluefin tuna fishery. The earliest we could get quota to operate this fishery is November 2021 to operate the following year. So it's we're in this for the long haul. It's a marathon rather than a sprint.
So, I mean, this is really exciting. It's one of the things that I picked up on very quickly when you started talking to the Angling Trust about it, because one thing I've always been keen on is how angling benefits coastal communities. What do you think this kind of fishery will actually do for the economies of places like Falmouth and Penzance and other places where Looe or Plymouth even, where these fish could be caught from?
I mean, the impact could be substantial. So could this make a difference? Well, yes. I mean, and the catch and release model actually is the way that you optimize the economic value of this resource whilst retaining the issue around sustainability. So the way to think about it simply is, say you had quota that basically equated to one fish. You just got X 100 pounds of quota, and that's one fish. So a commercial fishing operation goes out, catches that fish in Cornwall, brings it back, puts it into market. Now at the dockside, that fish is going to be worth between £2,000 to £3,000. Instead, if you take that one fish, so how do they operate? So you have to have a mortality assumption, and lots of studies have been done which show that if you run these fisheries very effectively, you can achieve a mortality rate, a post-release mortality rate of below 5%. So for every 100 fish you catch, up to 5 of them may perish, and you have to account for that. So say you've got a 5% mortality rate, and you're allowed to have one dead fish. Yep. that means you can have 20 hookups, yeah, before you assume you've used your quota. And this is how ICAT look at this process. Now, if you say you catch one fish per day on a charter boat, at 20 hookups is 20 charters. Now, at typical rates that they could charge, you're already talking about £13,000 to £15,000 of revenue from the charter fees alone, compared to the £2,000 to £3,000 for the commercially caught fish. Now, obviously, there are downstream, additional revenues that come from the processing, the wholesaling, etc., of the commercially caught fish. But a lot of those go outside of these areas.
The local area doesn't get that money, does it? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Because you get apart from the charter revenues that are going into these communities, you have the tourism dividend. It's going to be attracting people from all over the globe. Typically, you could expect around 50% more again on top of those charter revenues. One tuna ends up being worth more like £20,000. But in Canada, as a real working example of this, Canada has around a 500-ton quota from ICAT for Atlantic bluefin. Around 10 years ago, they took 50 tons of that and set it aside for the mortality quota for a purely live release recreational bluefin fishery. Per ton, a recreationally caught bluefin in Canada is worth over 6 times, between 6 and 8 times what the per ton value is of the commercially harvested fish. Another example to give you some sense of the scale of this, in 1994, there were some changes in the Gulf Stream, and literally in the space of 1 year, a winter bluefin tuna fishery appeared off of the coast of North Carolina, off of Hatteras on the Outer Banks. And fishermen, the US fisheries authorities responded really quickly, reallocated quota, so that these guys could get out there and fish for bluefin recreationally. Yeah. 3 years later, a consortium of universities came in and did an economic study on that fishery. Yeah.
Right.
3 years after the fish had appeared and the fishery had been set up, that was generating $5 million per year of revenue for the town of Hatteras, and three marinas that worked on it, and obviously some trickle down state taxes and so on. So the potential economic value of these fisheries is substantial. In the UK, this kind of fishery would spread those benefits through all of these communities. We know it's a model that works.
Fantastic. But I mean, how in the end do we go about establishing this fishery in the UK?
So first of all, we have to become a member of ICAT. Secondly, the case has to be made to the UK government. This is something they should be doing and investing in the short term. But we need the support of anglers, skippers, businesses in these communities. Then the government, if they buy the argument, has to go and request quota and win the arguments with ICAT. And that meeting, the first chance for us to do that is November 2021. Once all those are done, then you've got to put in place, your fishery.
So we've got these various steps, and what you're saying is that we're sort of 1.5 steps along that road, and then I think angler support, once that case is clear, will come, won't it? And then we've got to request the quota and then create this fishery. So we're kind of a little bit away down that road. It seems to me like we've got work to do, haven't we, in terms of making it happen.
To go to ICAT, we have to have an understanding of these fish in our waters. Sort of, how many of them are there? Where are they? What's the origin of their stock? And you have to have research programs, to help provide that evidence. So the government set up the Tunnus UK project in 2018, which is a quite a narrow satellite tagging based program. It's high tech, but because of the costs and so on, you can't tag many fish. And that's already answering a lot of questions, about the fish in our waters. But what the Irish and the Swedes and the Danes have done, and we're arguing we should do the same here. Alongside that, you need to run these larger scale, fluid tagging programs that really use recreational anglers. They answer different questions to the questions that a satellite tag, can answer. But if we can get that program for 2021, that will help our understanding. It also could act as a sort of a test bed for a fully fledged, larger scale fishery that would come from 2022 if we obtained quota. Fantastic.
Now, I know that a lot of anglers go shark fishing in the West Country from Loo. I've done it many times myself, Loo and Penzance and Falmouth. But the basic method of shark fishing is probably going to mean that occasionally anglers are going to hook up accidentally a bluefin tuna. If you're an angler and you hook one by accident, what do you do?
Yeah, well, actually, if I could just step back on that. So, what we should make clear is what the legal position is at the moment, as the MMO's interpretation and statements on the legal position. So, we have no quota. Recreational sea anglers in the UK are not permitted to target Atlantic bluefin, even for catch and release. But one way or another, fish are being caught. The skippers are telling me that you can't have a bait in the water for a blue shark without a bluefin coming along and snagging it first. So what we've been saying for several years is to these skippers is, look, if you're in these areas and the risk that you're going to catch bluefin is substantial, there's two things you could do. One is move, but these guys have livelihoods to make. Yeah, they've got charters, so you can't just keep moving your boat every time a tuna turns up. It's just economically going to destroy these guys' businesses, And secondly, think about the gear that you use. So it might take some of the sporting aspect away of your shark fishing, but really, you need to be thinking about. An absolute minimum, you should be talking about 50-pound class, tackle. We recommend 50, 80 rods and 50 wides as the floor, really. If you have a significant problem, then really, if you were to be targeting them under a fishery, we'd be saying, really, you're probably looking at 80-pound, tackle. Given that most boats in the UK haven't got fighting chairs, it's a stand up. So there are a couple of things you can do to start with. But if you do hook one of these fish, you want to try and get it to the boat as soon as possible. We've written a piece on this. I think that your magazine has published, and we'll put on our website again soon. It's like, here's a quick and dirty guide to how you get a bluefin to the boat reasonably quickly. The key thing is the recovery, because we can have these very low mortality rates for bluefin. They are incredibly robust fish, but during the process of extended fights, which will happen particularly with bycatch, with undergunned tackle, they suffer oxygen depletion, and there are various chemical changes, physiological changes that occur that put them on a process which can create long-term muscle damage, including heart failure. So, it is true that if you fight a bluefin for a long time, there are risks associated with it, but the really good news is that there are quite simple ways to address that. And that's why we have these sort of sub 5% mortality rates in recreational fisheries. And that's that you need to recover and reoxygenate the fish. If you reoxygenate the fish properly, it short circuits these processes, it brings them back into great condition, and they can swim off. And so you have between sort of 1% and 5% mortality rates, which we should be aiming for. So the key one is you mustn't board the fish. If you bring one to the side of the boat, don't bring it on board. They are robust. Secondly, get your recovery protocol sorted. And that's basically, you want to swim this fish at the side of the boat, preferably if you can swim it on the hook rather than putting chin gaps in that carry risks and so on. Swim the fish at the side of the boat between 5 and 8 knots, depending upon the sea state, the tide run, etc. And you can be swimming that fish for a minimum of sort of 5 or 6 minutes. But what you're really looking for is a series of processes. First thing that happens is that pectoral fins will start to flutter. And the second thing is you start to get some very strong tail beats. Now, when you see that, your temptation is going to be to say, this fish is fine, it's 100%, we can let it go. But really what you should do at that point is give it another few minutes, because the real measure of a bluefin being ready for release is, rather than laying on its side, it will begin to try to bring itself upright. And at that stage, that fish is in good condition, and you can be very confident that it will swim off very, very happily. But that process might take you 10 minutes, it might take you 20 to 30 minutes, but we owe it to these fish and ensure that we send fish away in very good shape.
Yeah, it's important that we're responsible about this.
We use, when we fish overseas, and we've done some work for the Tunnus UK program, catching fish, we have safety lines on the reels to the vessel. We have a safety guy behind the angler at all times in case the line goes. We have a whole series of protocols to ensure this is safe. And the leader in process can be quite hairy. I mean, these are big. These are 500-pound fish, some of them, that you're trying to leader at the side of the vessel. You need to know what you're doing. It's a terrible shame that we didn't get the 2020 chart program, because I think then we could start to put a framework in place, including sort of education and support for anglers to really help them, make the best of the situation that can be, can go wrong for all parties involved. So,
okay. So, in summary, Steve, how would you sort of frame what we've been talking about?
Well, I'll say, look, there's an incredible opportunity here. The numbers are recovering, the fish are here, we have a world-class fishery on our doorstep. The UK could really lead the way in establishing a model that sort of optimizes the economic value of these fish, extracts a lot of scientific value from sort of parallel, research programs, and it helps ensure sort of the long-term sustainability of the species. We have a chance in the UK to show that there is a better model, a model which benefits more people, generates more revenue, and is sustainable for the fish. So, you can find out a lot more about this on our website, www.bluefintuna.co.uk.
Okay.
The Angling Trust website carries quite a lot of material on it. You've got contact details on the website. People can get in touch with me. Look, Bluefin are back here. We need to ensure they have a future in UK waters, and that's not going to happen without support of anglers and skippers and businesses in these communities.
Well, I certainly think it's a fantastic campaign to get behind.
So on, and we've got a Facebook page, Blue Fin Tuna UK. We post a bunch of stuff on that. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Steve. I look forward to all that happening, and obviously we'll keep updating our readers and also on the Angling Trust website with the progress of this particular campaign, and look out for that. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Chip. Cheers.